Welcome to Markets Today. I'm your host, Mbithe Mwema. With us in studio is Eva, and she is the Executive Director of the East Africa Venture Capital Association. Eva oversees stakeholder engagements in as far as the private equity industry is concerned in Kenya, and she has oversight in terms of funds that are coming into the industry, the investor sentiments, and as well as openings in terms of investment opportunities that come through in this space. Welcome to the show, Eva.
Thank you for having me, Mbithe, and good to be back.
Most certainly, most welcome. Is COVID making your work harder, or what is happening in the private equity space now that we have the onslaught of COVID with us?
I will say it's definitely not business as usual anymore. I think the first months of March through to April, there was a bit of trying to find your headspace and how to engage with business, managing portfolios. But as we have continued to adapt to the current environment, a lot of the people are trying to see how to resume to the new normal, as it's now being referred to. So we're seeing a bit of lagged transactions where you would have done deals or due diligence as a start by flying into the country, or for foreign investors, or in the case of local investors is traveling into the potential portfolio. That's not as easily accessible as it was before. So having to navigate the new environment of due diligence. There's also the aspect that some of the regulators who approve transactions may not be as accessible. They're now working offline if you think of mergers approvals. So there's a bit of delay also in getting regulatory consent. So all in all, we're trying to adapt with what we have in the new environment, but it's definitely not the same as it was.
Has there been a material change in terms of the deal flow that you're seeing before COVID, after COVID, and is the impact on the economy making it slightly worse off in terms of the deals and the visibility of these deals that you're seeing in your space?
I will have to start by saying that private equity is long-term investing, right? So we're looking at beyond 5 years. A lot of the deals that would have been actualized in the year 2020, the process of transaction review probably began in 2019 and maybe before that. So in that sense, we wouldn't say that the immediate would necessarily affect the deal flow that would have been done in 2020. Having said that, some of the items I spoke to earlier, regulatory consent, those may impact our ability to announce the deals within the year 2020, at least the first half of this year, depending on how easily the markets reopen. And then again, going into the future, any deals we would potentially have been looking at this year, starting the negotiation process, maybe the delay will happen as you look to get the market to adjust to its right or fair value. And that translates even for private sector companies. What's the fair value after COVID, given the stability or readjustment of the performance? So again, it becomes a bit hard to value a company in the current environment, and you probably have to take a forward-looking approach, which is really what we do in the first place as private capital investors. But we need some sort of stability, so probably delay any transactions that would have commenced in the year 2020. But anything that began before, it's pretty much okay to engage, and we are currently doing our deals in this environment.
What about the possible incidence of exits? Are you seeing any weakness in the economy necessitating exits, necessitating maybe discounted valuations, or necessitating or even bringing to the fore opportunities that were not existent before COVID? And maybe just to put it into perspective, we have seen companies such as Tusky saying they are delaying paying some of their suppliers. So liquidity is becoming a problem for some of these businesses. Is that something that's becoming emergent? Are you seeing investors wanting to exit, or are you seeing new opportunities coming to the fore as a consequence of COVID?
Yeah, certainly. An exit requires a buyer, right? And in the current environment, it's unlikely you will get someone willing to buy right now, because they're not sure what the valuation of that business is. Add to that is what you just pointed out, some of the emerging risks of doing business in such a tough environment, the liquidity issues. It's unlikely you get a new buyer willing to take that risk upfront, and they may want to delay that to a later time, at least when it's a bit more clear about their sources of cash flow going forward. So we're seeing more deals coming in. So I think around April, we saw NIVAS getting some funding from IFC and Ametis. Since then, in May, we've had Moringa Schools getting new funding from DLB Equity. And then we have in Ethiopia, CFS Capital just invested and announced yesterday that they had closed a transaction in one of the leading manufacturers in FMCG, East Africa Alliance brand. So it's PE. This is the space we play in. We are there to support businesses, and to the extent that we had begun the transaction and identified that a company was a good investment portfolio, there's no limitation even with COVID to come in. If anything, we identify this as the best time to provide the value that we have always said we do, beyond the capital, also injecting the strategic guidance to navigate this. But in terms of PE itself, getting out of a transaction, it may be a bit difficult a moment to do that. So exits are unlikely to be realized, at least within the first half of 2020.
Thank you so much for the overview of the last 3 transactions. Could you walk us through the valuations that these transactions were transacted at and the amounts that were injected into these businesses?
Okay, so it's as you can expect of private equity, transactions tend to be very private. So at the moment, there was none of the 3 deals that I've mentioned had disclosed the valuations at which the transactions were closed. Yeah.
In terms of how much money was put in by the different investors?
So not necessarily specific to the deal, but what we know is the bound brackets within which these companies invest. So if you consider Ametis, it's one of the medium-sized investors. They do anything between $10 to $50 million investment. So you would have to assume that that is the space within which they invested. For CFIAS that I said closed yesterday, it's between $5 to $15 million of transactions. So again, without being very specific, you can just look at the investment strategy and try and see, looking at the profile of the company, how much do you think it would have attracted? So, but unfortunately, we do not have the precise numbers.
Thank you so much for that. We've seen the government come out with different proposals, and the government is in a space where they have a fiscal deficit. They're trying to manage this, and they want to see what support they can get either from retirement benefits or for different asset classes such as private equity. What proposals have been brought to the floor? What do this mean for your space, and what are your sentiments in as far as these proposals are concerned?
All right, so the immediate one is something you mentioned earlier around liquidity management. For us, we look at it as preservation of the value of the business, because we want to retain that value for a future exit. And so liquidity management is one of the things that's a growing concern, not necessarily a concern, but a growing active item that private equity investors are looking into. And some of the items that the government has provided, encouraging banks to give moratoriums, for instance. It's not forced, but encouraging them, it goes a long way in terms of how we as investors work with our portfolios to manage their debt repayment structures. The other thing is some of the flexibilities around taxation policies that has really come in handy in terms of feeding into our liquidity preservation strategies. So all in all, I think across East Africa, a lot of the government or fiscal policies that have been enacted have been positive in terms of preserving shareholder value and working to realize the investors' agenda. But I still believe that there could be room for more growth, especially in core sectors such as manufacturing or technology, which not only drive production, but are also used to attract investors into the region.
Okay. Is there anything that could possibly have a direct impact on private equity investors? I know earlier in the week we did see your article in the Business Daily with your sentiments on some of the proposals. Could you walk us through that?
Friend's proposal was in reaction to an emerging or a proposal made by the Capital Markets Authority, which is the regulator for financial or institutional investors in Kenya. And they have made a provision there to introduce oversight to private equity firms that are raising fundraising from local public funds. At the moment, we still do not have a definition of what constitutes a local public fund. It could be a government fund, for instance, we do not know, or is it a listed company? It's still unclear. And so the sentiment we shared is we need to tread carefully, especially in this COVID environment, because we're doing as much as we can as private capital investors to support the existing business environment, to stabilize the business environment. And we should be working with regulators to build that capacity instead of distracting our attention to work towards regulation. So I will give CMA credit that they did reach out to us and inform us that that was coming up. And it's an ongoing conversation that we will be looking into during this COVID period, but also beyond, because I think the implication is actually that it will get into effect probably after COVID.
What does this oversight look like, or what is the Capital Markets Authority intention when it wants to bring this proposal of oversight for local private equity funds or companies that are raising that kind of money?
Without really speaking on their behalf, my understanding is that they want to provide some level of protection to public funds, public pension funds here, so that they invest in people that are identified by, or CMA is aware of, the funds that they would be coming to fundraise from the public funds. It's still not clear how that will take shape. A lot of the private equity funds are not within the Kenyan jurisdiction, so it still remains to be seen how that will be effected. But my understanding is actually that CMA wants to incentivize local public pension funds to invest more in alternative assets, and they believe that this will provide some level of confidence to them.
Okay. Now, just going back and looking at the economy, because now we're getting to the point where the government has a good sense of what the health pandemic means, but there's an expected lag when it comes to the financial impact on the private sector as well as on government operations. What does this mean for the outlook in the private equity space? Are you seeing more opportunities? Are you a bit bearish on the investment case when you look at Kenya as a whole? And the second part to this question would be, are there opportunities or sectors that jump out to you as sectors that could possibly offer value in the medium term?
I think we sometimes can get a bit harsh on the government. It's just been 3 months. So maybe even for us, we're still trying to find our way, and we can appreciate that it will be some time before we get a clear picture. If I just start with the last question that you offered, there are some sectors that are emerging to be winners in terms of new opportunities created. The one that I can pick off, which may not be too obvious, is manufacturing. Their ability to stretch their capacity beyond their core services to introduce new service lines like production of hand sanitizers product for them, just presents an opportunity for private financing to come and align to that idea of expanding the market or expanding the product lines, right? The other one is technology. Previously, we'd seen a lot of technology that supports B2B getting funded by private capital, but now we've seen a more direct, we've seen an uptake of technology that links to the customer. So there's more demand for B2C, business to consumer driven technology that will be providing more value to private equity investors, and it's definitely a space to watch. The third one is healthcare, just because we now realize the gaps that require funding within the health system. And I think as the pandemic unfolds, we've now been able to see the different spaces of healthcare provision, whether it's equipment resourcing or expansion of capacity or even expansion of the resources, human capital resources. There's just so much that we've now learned is available for private capital investors to look into within the healthcare space. And then finally is education. So we as private equity always say that our mission is to provide value alongside the capital that we inject. And education has become dynamic now. It's no longer about the physical infrastructure or getting children in classrooms. Innovation in education is the next frontier. How do you deliver the same quality using digital skills? And I think that's a space that private capital can really add value in terms of investing for innovation within the education sector. So all in all, it's very bullish for us because just all the opportunities that have come to be aligned with what PE is about, which is investing into innovation and new opportunities for growth.
That at least the that are jumping out. Eva, when you look at the returns without infringing on any proprietary information, can you give us a sense of whether your expectation in as far as returns in the private equity space has changed or is changing with the onset of COVID? So were you expecting X before this, and has COVID now meant now you're at X minus a certain percentage? And what's really what is a good return that would typically whet your appetite, and has that changed because of the onset of COVID?
All right, so we don't always disclose our returns, right? But just to put perspective, at least for fund performance, we look at a 10-year horizon because PE funds return money to their investors, the pension funds, and after 10 years, which means this space of the year 2020 and the disruption that has happened is one of a 10-year period. And when you look at it from that perspective, then you realize we may not get as big a hit as probably other assets would, because ours is a 10-year horizon. And that speaks to the investor into PE, such as pension funds, right? For us who are then investing into portfolio companies, we invest again between 5 to 7 years, and often provide for a disruptive year. It could be an election year, it could be what's happening right now. So again, that doesn't necessarily us of our valuations. The challenge would be to anyone who was trying to exit within the year 2020. Obviously, they have to hold for longer, and that would probably have an implication onto the valuation they assign to that portfolio. So for us, we still retain that our outlook for EE fund returns to our investors is within the upper quartiles, 25% IRR. And it's probably the same that we chase for our investee companies. Now, different PE firms have different investment strategies and promises, and expectations for returns. So, but from a general perspective, those are some of the ranges that we look to when we're making an investment.
In local currency or in dollar returns?
A lot of it is benchmarked on the dollar because we raise in hard currency and we invest in hard currency as well.
Is there anything else that you feel is pertinent when we were talking about the private equity space and the outlook in the Kenyan economy today that our audience would need to pay attention to?
I think one of the things that has emerged from COVID is that there's a lot more room for us, private capital and other sources of capital, to collaborate in execution of deal activity, but also to provide the sustenance capital required for our business ventures on the ground. And so maybe an appeal to other fund sources, be it the insurance firms or pension funds or even commercial lenders who we already have a good relationship with, to look at aligning themselves with the long-term investors, whether it's PE or the other kinds that may be there in the market, for to offer the immediate solutions that are required to keep the business environment afloat during this pandemic. We all need to have a long-term view, and some of us who've been doing it for some time as private equity can work with pension funds, insurance firms, and some commercial lenders to look at the optimum ways to generate this value for their own portfolios, but also for the businesses that we will be looking to support. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eva. That's all the time we had today. I like that you have just reiterated that it has to be a long-term view, and this is one of many disruptions that any investor should be able to factor into their models. So we certainly appreciate your time. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you soon. This has been an interesting conversation with us here at Markets today, discussing the private equity market, trying to identify what is happening there in terms of fund flows into this space, or exits and returns. And Eva, who sits as an executive director at the East Africa Venture Capital Association, has given us the fact that our investment, our horizon needs to be on a long-term basis. Yes, COVID has happened, but then you still have to be able to chase returns, and there's still more opportunities that are becoming emergent in this space. I like it when I hear more positivity than negativity, so we certainly appreciate your time, Eva. That's all from us today here at Markets Today. We hope to see you again, same time. Good day.